This morning's scripture is 1 Peter 2, verses 1 through 10 from the New Revised Standard Version. Rid yourselves, therefore, of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure, spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, "See, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. To you then who believe, he is precious, but for those who do not believe, that stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the word, as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." May God add his blessing to the reading of his word.
I love it when folks come to annual gathering for the first time. Annual gathering used to be called the State Assembly for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Northern California and Nevada back in the day. It's when all the Disciples of Christ churches from Northern California and Nevada come together to worship and to do business and to have fun. But when it comes to annual gathering, I'm afraid I find myself falling into the same trap that folks in our congregations fall into sometimes. And that is, I long for the good old days when our local congregations would assemble at Asilomar Retreat Center in Pacific Grove. I think, oh my gosh, I miss this 300 plus people who would be under the assembly hall and going out on the beach and watching the sunsets and then going and eating little snacks and at the after parties that the organizations put on. I just miss that so much. Because see, I am so focused on all the things that I miss. But then, when I see somebody attending annual gathering for the first time, I realize that they, having no prior experience, only see the good things. Now, Nancy Thompson, she came with me last week to the annual gathering, and it was her first time. Now, she saw all the good things, and one of the things that she said was, boy, there is a lot of diversity in our region. This is a diverse gathering. And I get to thinking about it. You're right, because we have Samoan churches, we have Hispanic churches, we have black churches, we have big churches, little churches, rural churches, country churches, urban churches, and everything in between. We have different styles of worship. We have different mission priorities. We have different ways of how we serve our communities and different specialties in how we work our mission and ministry out. As a region, we are diverse. But then again, so are we here in the local congregation, because we all come from different places. Some of us come from out of state. Some of us are native Chico people. Some of us grew up in big cities. Some of us grew up in small cities. Some of us grew up in the country. Some of us grew up overseas even. Some are burning with a passion for social justice, and then there's other here just looking for a sanctuary and a safe place where we can give and receive kindness. We've got business owners. We've got farmers. We've got teachers. We've got social workers. We've got nurses. We've got managers. We've got just about anything under the sun vocationally here represented in this church. We all come, healthy and sick. We come with various physical and mental health issues. We come with painful life stories. We come with a variety of life experiences that shape who and what we are. We come with partners. We come with spouses. We come with siblings. We come with children, grandchildren, parents, pets even. And we come alone. And that's fine too. We are an odd bunch. But you know what? That's okay. We are a motley crew. Now, you know where that term motley crew came from? And I'm not talking about the 80s hair metal band either. Motley crew is a term that was used to refer to the crews of 17th and 18th century British ships, because the crews on these ships came from all over the world and spoke all sorts of different languages and represented all sorts of different cultures, and so they were motley crews. All churches are motley crews to some degree, but sometimes it's hard to celebrate the diversity that comes along with that title, because throughout the history of the church, folks have always asked, wouldn't it be nice if we were all a little more alike than different? Wouldn't it be nice if we all liked the same kind of music, or if we were all on the same page socially or politically? Wouldn't it be nice if we were all mature, demure, quiet, polite, soft-spoken, balanced, and kind? Wouldn't it be, comfortable if we never experienced frustration or conflict? Wouldn't it be wonderful if none of us had any issues? Maybe. But exactly, good luck. But it wouldn't be church, would it? It would not be church. The people of God have always been a motley crew. They've never fit together perfectly. Even in the earliest church communities, there were arguments and struggles over who belonged and who didn't. There were arguments about women and men, Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free. On one hand, this is great. On one hand, women were hosts and sponsors and active leaders in the church. But then on the other hand, women were told to be quiet and submit to men's authority. And on one hand, Gentiles, non-Jewish people, were welcomed into the early church just as they were. But then on the other hand, Gentiles were told that they had to be circumcised first. Guys, boo, we can do the same thing. Boo, So even as early as the end of the first century, there were lots of tensions in the church. Men and women, slaves, free, Jews, Gentiles, who belonged? Who belonged in that early church? Well, the early Christian churches were formed from groups of people with radically different backgrounds and radically different expectations about how we should live. It was messy. And so now, here in the 21st century, we live in a culture that doesn't have as many social taboos as there were in the first and second century. So it's difficult for us to appreciate how remarkable it was that the early church was able to cross some of the social divides that existed during that time and place. For example, many early Christians identified as devout Jews. And for a devout Jewish man to eat alongside a Gentile was unheard of. Even worse would be a Jewish man who ate alongside a Gentile woman who was eating bacon. He would be and would feel defiled, and he would be excluded from the temple and the rest of the Jewish community until he had gone through ritual purification. But this is exactly what participation in the church could lead to. Sharing a meal across social divides could have consequences that are difficult for us to even imagine. So this morning, we heard just a little snippet of Peter's letter to these scattered churches spread out within these territories in the Roman Empire. And in this letter, he was trying to address what it means to be a church and how to be Christian in diverse places and cultures. Even within this single letter, we see some of the tensions that were present during that early church. For example, Peter tells his readers that they are God's own people. And then later, in a section that Kathy didn't read from, he also says that God's people must obey the emperor and that wives must obey their husbands. But the emperor demanded that his subjects fall flat on their faces and worship his statue as it was paraded through the streets. Could a Christian who isn't supposed to worship graven images truly obey the emperor when they're required to worship his statue? Probably not. And what about obeying pagan husbands? Pagan husbands could and would require their wives to make the necessary sacrifices to the ancestors, to the household gods. That's what wives were expected to do. That's what they did. But God's people are commanded to worship no other gods. So, could a Christian woman be fully obedient to both God and her pagan husband? Again, probably not. In fact, one cannot obey God and obey the emperor, or obey God and obey one's pagan husband. And listen, I'm not picking on Peter, I'm not picking on the emperor, I'm not picking on pagan husbands. I am just trying to show you how conflicted that early church was when it came to understanding how to be God's people. This group of Jews and Gentiles, men and women, slaves and free, had trouble working out exactly how to do and be the church, even back then. And even though 2,000 years have passed, churches are still asking these questions. These days we're not arguing over how to include Gentiles or anything like that, or whether they have to be circumcised if they want to be Christian. But there are plenty of lively conversations in churches about the leadership of women, the leadership or inclusion of LGBTQ folks, about the rights of those who are baptized as infants versus adults, about what it means to welcome children, and so on and so on and so on. Who belongs? Who leads? Who has a say or a voice or a vote? What makes a church a church? And where are all the normal people? Whatever that means. I find it very comforting to realize that questions like these have been asked for as long as the church has been in existence. So, if we want some insight into what makes church what it is, we might look back to its earliest days, and we will find that despite conflict and confusion, the early church had some pretty good answers. So let's go back to Peter's letter here. In this section that Kathy read, he wrote, "Once you were a people." So what does this mean? Well, the Greek word that's used there is laos, and that means people or population. That's the best translation for that. More precisely, it was often used to mean a group with common cultural bonds and ties. So when we are not a people, we're just a bunch of humans with nothing that holds us together. We're strangers in a crowd. We're a motley crew. And in many ways, in this and every church, we're still a motley crew. Every week, we join together with people from all different places who have different histories, different values, different expectations, and different ways of communicating. And yet, we have this one big thing in common, and that is our faith in Jesus Christ. We are all here this morning because we have placed our trust in him, and many of us have been baptized in his name. And through this faith and through this baptism, we have transcended our backgrounds and our cultures, and then we have become joined in something new, the culture of God. And when we are a part of the culture of God, we are no longer just a motley crew or just faces in the crowd. By joining together, we become God's own people, a holy nation, a royal priesthood. Now, of course, it doesn't always feel like that. This is because we're human, we're flawed, and still in this never-ending process of embracing and embodying God's culture. And yet, by joining together, we are already God's people, ready to proclaim God's light. Now, I get it. There are times when we want to belong to a group that's easier and maybe confirms all our values and habits and social norms. It's tempting to want this from the church. But a homogeneous group is not the church. You know what is? A country club. And I will guarantee you that the people in this room are more interesting than any country club out there. This group here is part of a culture which has always required its members to transcend all these human barriers. It's a group that invites us to see past male and female, child and adult, gay and straight. It's a group that communicates across social classes and social divides. It's a group that requires us to break bread and drink wine and live in love and peace with whoever turns up at this table, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from. We may not always understand each other. We may not always communicate with each other. Heck, we may not always even like each other. But in responding to God's generous mercy and in joining together here around this table, we are committed to living in love from this day forward. When we come together each week, when we share bread and wine around this table and snacks after service, when we share our stories, when we listen to each other, when we encourage one another, we are already doing something kind of strange and countercultural and priestly and wonderful. We're already communicating across boundaries and loving across human divides. And it doesn't stop here. We do this work here because it's our calling. And church is a great place to practice. But then we got to take it home. Right? It seems like the problem with taking it home is that in the culture that we live in today, it seems rather fashionable to not get along. It seems very fashionable to fail to love across boundaries. But our calling is to live differently, both here in the church and in every part of our lives. We are a motley crew. But in witnessing to God's mercy and love, we become a people of God together. And the more we practice, both here and out there in the world and at home, and the more we love and listen and learn from each other across every boundary that the world throws up between us, then the more we will grow into this identity as God's own people. And who knows where that will lead?